Hi, I'm Valerio Ventura, art director on Velma, and you are listening to a podcast named Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
The gang's all here, they're on the case, and there's no ghost that they wouldn't face, 'cause they dig it, Scooby-Doo. Yeah, they dig it, Scooby-Doo.
Hey, gang, and welcome to another episode of a podcast named Scooby-Doo, the show that delves into the rich 80-plus year history of Hanna-Barbera and Scooby-Doo media. Join me, Mike Josick, and my various guests as each episode we take a deep dive into the rich tapestry of classic cartoons, iconic characters, and the lasting animated legacy of William Hanna and Joseph Barbera. So fire up the mystery machine, grab yourself some Scooby snacks, and let's start the show.
Wake up, wake up, wake up! This is Jack Jetwash, your slipped disc jockey, on 3D TV at 7:30 hours on this good morning.
Hello, and welcome to episode 56 of the podcast. It's good to have you back for part 2, the concluding part of my conversation with podcaster, writer, and audio historian Greg Ehrbar. In the following hour, we talk a lot more about his book, Hanna-Barbera, A Recorded History, From Modern Stone Age to Meddling Kids, something we didn't do as much in the first hour in part 1. We talked a lot about animation history and HB history, and probably could have gone on for quite a while doing just that, but being the conscientious interviewer / moderator that I am, I felt that we should probably at some point bring it back to the thing that Greg was actually on the podcast to promote, which is the book. So in hour 2 here, we do talk a lot more about the book. It's a great book. It's a really good reference for Hanna-Barbera history and talks a lot about the records that they put out, their sound effects library, the voice actors, the music. It's pretty great, and I'm happy to promote it on the show because it is a worthwhile entry into the Hanna-Barbera scholarship that seems to be picking up pace among people who talk about and study animation. Now, if you haven't heard part 1, I would recommend hitting the feed. It's episode 55, the one just before this one. Check that out, and then come on back and listen to the concluding chapter. And for those of you who have already heard part 1, I will take a step back here so that you can get on to finishing of my conversation with writer, podcaster, audio historian, Greg Ehrbar. Hope you enjoy it, and I will see you all on the other side. So I said I wanted to get back to the book, and we have it on there. So I'm going to go back to the book. I'm curious, we talked very early on in our conversation about the research that you did and how it kind of started simple and then got bigger. And that's always been sort of the blessing or the beautiful thing, as well as the curse of research, is that it's always opening doors and leading you down rabbit holes, and projects inevitably get bigger and bigger because of it. How long, what kind of a journey did you go on research-wise?
It was about 5 years.
Wow.
It started out, I pitched, because I do for about 10 years now, I've done a regular feature for Jerry Beck on cartoonresearch.com called Animation Spin. And I take recordings related to cartoons, but I give them, I treat them like the art they are. And I use Leonard Maltin's Disney Films format. I told him, I said, I hope I'm not, I'm imitating you, but I like the way he writes, and I like the way he organizes the credits and the songs and all that. So it was giving them documentation. And it's just, that's the sort of thing you do as a labor of love. But they accumulated after a while. So I went back to the publisher that did Mousetracks, and I said, would you like me to flesh this out? And they said, rather than that, let's focus. on a subject. And I said, well, what about Hanna-Barbera? Because and I even had no idea that there were over 500 records connected with them. I thought it was a couple of hundred. And they said, that would be something we could probably sell. Let's give that a shot. And the University Press of Mississippi were really encouraging, because as the project was growing, I didn't know exactly where to take it. And my wife was like, the best thing for you to do is not let anybody stand on your shoulder, saying you should do this, you should do, don't worry what people will say after. Write it from your heart. This is a story you really have been dying to tell, and so that's kind of what I did. And as like you said, it goes on and on and on. And the biggest frustration is that you have to stop and you have to go back, and it's like, oh, I want to add this in, or oh, I wish I could have phrased this a little different, or oh, that kind of thing. They say actors don't always like to see themselves on screen. It's the same when you read something you've done. It's well, I'm proud of it. I am, but I could always improve it. I could always hone it, but not be doing it forever. And at some point you have to stop. So that is the toughest thing. And so the research was partially over the years I was working on it and focusing on it, and then, gathering all of these recordings and going through them over and over and over again, which I kind of had anyway. And also watching and or listening to as many cartoons as I could, all 415 Smurfs, a couple of times, because the audio of Hanna-Barbera is so, significant. So, and as opposed to, and then when you watch it, it's a different experience. I've always felt like you can listen to the soundtrack of the Jetsons' first 2 episodes on Colpix Records. It's totally different than watching the episodes, because your senses are different. You pick up on different things when you don't have a picture. So I did a lot of that, and reading credits, fixing things, talking to people, interviewing people. I was very lucky to get an interview with the sound effects editor that did the Jetsons stuff, and he revealed a lot of stuff he was reluctant to. He said, I never talked about this before, but I'd like to get some credit for it, because but he was very guarded, and it took a while to gain his confidence. But
why do you think that is?
Well, because success has many fathers. It's like I like to say my Aunt Sadie created Bugs Bunny, because everybody who worked in the termite terrace claims to have created him. And it's a group effort. So I think when you work in an organization, not everybody knows who did what, or can be sure of who did what. Not everybody can be. When somebody says, I was there, okay, what room were you in? What meeting did you go to? Did you go to every meeting that could possibly be happening at one given time? Were you omnipotent? Or did you hear it from somebody who was there while you were there? It's like, I'll give you an example. Gene Kelly again. There's misreports, and it was a great thing to be able to clear the air about some of these misreports, that when Gene Kelly approached Walt Disney about having Mickey dance, or Donald dance in an MGM thing, Walt Disney snapped, Mickey will never dance in an MGM film. It's a lie, because Mickey danced in 2 of them. He was in Hollywood Party with Jimmy Durante, and he was on screen portrayed by a simian of some sort in a Mickey costume in Babes in Toyland with Laurel and Hardy. So he was in 2, and the 3 Little Pigs were in that as well, with his complete permission. He was delighted to do it. It's just that in 1943-44, the Disney studio was almost completely taken over by the military. When people talk about Walt Disney's sympathies during the war, excuse me, no one studio did more for the war effort than Walt Disney. No other studio did. And he did it so there would be success and people would be free and all of that stuff. I mean, that was a war about freedom and all that stuff. So to say a lot of the negative things that are being said, read a book, for God's sake, a good book. Or, the fact is, between having people in the service who weren't in the studio, and then having the military coming in, giving him limited budgets that he'd always go over, to get these things done, because he wanted the films to be great, and then making a feature, Victory Through Air Power, which as a commercial film was insane, but it was to do it to convince the military to do this and the public that it was viable. Just like in the 50s, all those films about space travel were to help convince the public to be on board with what NASA was doing. Walt Disney was not what a lot of people said he was. He was certainly not perfect, but he wasn't the things that they're slandering about. Back to Hanna-Barbera. Gene Kelly was told by Walt, it's a great idea. And I know Louis B. Mayer were friends, I would be happy to intercede for you. I'll write a letter or whatever. What ended up happening was, I think that Joe Barbera said that too, and it's not true. But I don't think Joe Barbera was at the meeting. That's my whole point. Joe Barbera did not go to Walt Disney's office with Gene Kelly. He was working on Tom and Jerry cartoons. So that's what Joe heard. And I think he also suspected that the producer of the Tom and Jerry cartoons, Fred Quimby, now that they were successful, wanted to keep them working on nothing else and did not want them to be distracted by other things. So, however that story got around, it certainly didn't serve anybody better than to say that Walt Disney said that. I don't know where it originated, but it simply isn't true, because Gene Kelly's widow was told it by Gene Kelly. Walt Disney never ever said that. And she has made it her mission to tell the truth about stuff. So that's my point, is that, were you there? Were you there after the meeting? Were you, those kind of things. And that's the hardest part of doing research. In Mousetracks, I interviewed Fess Parker about the Davy Crockett stuff. And he was very ticked off that the version by Bill Hayes was a huge hit because it got out the door faster. And he felt like Disney sat on it. And he was kind of ticked. But what he didn't know was that Disney had licensed it to Columbia Records, a very big company. And they had they had layers to go through. So it took them longer. Cadence Records was a one-man shop. And they could get that thing out in a couple of days, and it was out and playing. So, it isn't always what you perceive. Sometimes the circumstances are.
Yeah, that's something that it frustrates me about Scooby history, and that I kind of push back on sometimes, because everybody who was supposedly in that room has a slightly different story. And I almost got to be able to talk to Ruby and Spears, but it was right at the end, and they were obviously not doing well health-wise, and it just kind of never happened. But everyone who was in that room is now also deceased. So it's you just sort of have to take all of the different stories and mash them together and find the commonalities and be I guess that must be the truth. But, I've heard, because Silverman's got his whole, the Frank Sinatra on the plane thing, but then Iwo Takamoto has, this name has been bouncing around the studio for years, and there's a sketch with a dog and it says Scooby or whatever. And there's just, the historian in me looks at all of that, and it's well, we can't be conclusive about it. So I just hate when people decisively say this is the way it is. I prefer to say, so this is either the preferred narrative, or this is what we know, or whatever. But it's a struggle when you're, especially, you talked about the sound editor who didn't really want to talk. And I've had a few people who just flat out have said, I don't want to talk about my Hanna-Barbera career. That's just, they're not proud of that work. They're not proud of those cartoons, and that's it. And I'm okay. And that's a part of the story that you're not going to get. So
I've talked to a couple of people who, they put it in perspective. But it was still fun. It was a job, but it was fun. Some people thought it was. It just depends. Everybody looks at a job as in a different way. I was a copywriter. To some people, that's a rung to being, a real writer. But, some people, that's what their goal is, to be a copywriter, to be a voice artist. There are some people who are professional voice artists and are the greatest at it. There are some people who think, well, that's a stepping stone to get on camera or something, or being on camera is more important, or, but that's all relative. The main thing is to just do the best work you can. The work itself is really what counts. And if there's anything about Hanna-Barbera's product that fits, is it's work. It was hard work, done as well as it could possibly be done. So I Willie Ito has nice things to say about his days, and he worked at both Disney and at Hanna-Barbera. Floyd Norman, he worked on a lot of those shows, those 70s ones and all. Yeah, he worked at Disney and he worked on Jungle Book and he knew Walt Disney, but he still had fun working on Captain Caveman and Quickie Koala.
I was actually really curious to listen to your Floyd Norman episode, because I've heard other interviews with him where he has been a little bit salty about his Scooby work.
I have his books. I have his, and every workplace you poke fun at the bosses. In every workplace, you're fully aware of what's wrong and what could be better. I think it's just like your family. Good Lord, we can all do impressions of our relatives, to a T.
And that's why you talk to as many people as you can, because it's not all sunshine and roses, but it's also not all, working in the salt mines, and it's usually somewhere in between. And
I just think Hanna-Barbera's gotten too much of that, of the other, almost consistently. And it isn't that stuff isn't true, but it's not as true as you might think. And there's also a lot that may not be realized that has to be understood. And there's a lot of huge positives, but it's such it's almost 100-year history if you consider what came after they passed, because there's still new stuff coming out. Look at Walt Disney. I mean, for gosh sakes, there are great Walt Disney books. Same thing with Warner's. Everybody who, Chuck Jones' book you've got, and Chuck Jones' book is about Chuck Jones. So, and he has a very specific attitude of it. There is no book. I don't know if there is a Bob McKinson. He didn't do his own book. I think there might be one, or someone's working on one. There's Arthur Davis. There's, Frank Tashlin. My goodness, he went into movies. Everybody's trajectory was different. So their level of legend within that is different. The Chuck Jones and Bob Clampett and those guys lived into the 70s when animation was being studied finally, and they were making documentation, and they were there, so they were the ones, and they had their perspectives, but it wasn't just their perspectives. So, and it's the same thing with Disney. Is one of the nice things is there are historians who are still mining information about a lot of other employees over the years who were just not known. That's the thing about Mousetracks, is there's more people in that book that aren't known. I mean, you've got Annette and the Sherman Brothers, and Fess Parker, and Sterling Holloway, and the names that people know, Paul Frees, but you've got Roby Lester, Terry York, Bob Gerbeau, Tootie Camerata, my hero, one of the greatest musical directors of the 20th century, but he wasn't a guy who ran around bragging. He just did his work. Those are the kind of people who made these companies great. And at Hanna-Barbera, there were thousands of them coming and going. Some of them stand their entire lives. And, the work can't help but be some better than others. And everybody likes some things more than they like others. But I love Hair Bear Bunch. I think it's funny, and I don't care who knows it. And what else is starting to grow on me is Yogi's Space Race, because it's so insane. It's completely insane. I mean, God only knows how Joe sold that, and what came out of that meeting, because it's like Wacky Races. It's an aerospace like Star Wars. Instead of Boo Boo, we have Scare Bear, who looks like he's in a constant state of shock, and we're going to get Joe Besser for that. And then you got Gary Owens, the ultimate, Gary Owens, and then they got this weird captain who turns into a villain, and then the announcer doesn't know that. It makes absolutely no sense. But for some reason, it's very funny and entertaining, and there's only a handful of those. But if you look at them as like British TV shows, they only make a handful of shows. It's limited series. It's like a streaming series. There's only 16. That's all there's going to be. Look at them as a package. Look at those as that's the package of the shows, not it ran and ran and ran. But these are the shows. It's kind of a new perspective on things. Wait Till Your Father Gets Home is probably the most discovered of theirs, that because it's running a lot on MeTV Tunes. And it never was presented well. The prints were terrible. And that's a very delicate New Yorker-like look. That looks like a panel gag cartoon come to life. And that look was totally washed out and lost in its original run. And now looking at it now, the perspective of it and how the times have changed and not changed, and what's dated about it and what's not, it's pretty sharp. I wish there were more. They're not, but that's the thing about great work, is that you go back. Scooby-Doo is, some people will say, oh my gosh, every Scooby-Doo is the same. How could every Scooby-Doo be the same? And there've been these many versions of it. And I think I say this in the book, the very repetitiveness of the first show has become legend. It's mentioned all over the place. I just was reading an Archie's Weird Mysteries story in one of the digests, and it spoofed Scooby-Doo. And they start saying jinkies. What's that mean? Why are you saying these things? I don't know. It's part of the, the meddling kids is part of, and who knew in '69, because they said it every week. But they didn't just do that format. They took it to other things. How different is that than Abbott and Costello meet the? It's infinite. You can either riff on the formula and do it that way. You can make fun of the formula, or you can send it off in another direction, which is what some of like the 13 Ghosts did, or the Pup Named, or it's a durable concept. I don't know how to explain it, but it works.
I kind of look at the broader catalog of Hanna-Barbera cartoons the same way that I look at the Scooby cartoons. There's a lot of commentary within the community, people who are, well, that's not my Scooby, and I don't like the direction this is taking and whatever. And I'm always like, there's 55 years of stuff. Like, okay, this new thing maybe isn't, your cup of tea, but there's other stuff. There's so much stuff. And you look at the Hanna-Barbera catalog, maybe not every cartoon is for you. Maybe not every show hits, all the right marks for you, but it doesn't have to. There's decades and decades and decades of shows. Like, maybe, try some, see which ones you like. I love Josie and the Pussycats.
Oh, I do too.
Scooby-Doo. I love Yogi Bear. I love, until I saw Jellystone, I didn't care about Loopy the Loop. I love the Jellystone Loopy de Loop. She's my spirit animal.
And that's true too. And then the El Kabong character, they did really fun things with them. And Loopy is now one of my favorite characters, because they're showing them. They showed them for a while on Cartoon Network and USA, but because of what I know about the musical score and that they were theatrical, and how can you not identify with Loopy? It's life is tough for him. He's trying to get respect, and I think Dawes Butler's voice is great, but I like the Loopy and Jellystone as well. That's a good example of how the durability of being able to just find new. I love that Winnie Witch is in them too. She's a great character, and Gene Vanderpyle loved doing Winnie Witch.
I think a lot of people lump all of Hanna-Barbera sort of together, and it's like there's so many different flavors and there's so many different tones. They tried so many different things, and it's like you just have to find, where your sweet spot is and stick to that lane, right? Like, it doesn't all have to be for you.
No, it's too big. I mean, I get kidded like, oh, Greg, you like everything. Well, I find a lot of joy in things. That's a gift. I like some stuff better than others, but I do enjoy these things a lot, and they're just so fun. Their pretension is generally not an issue with almost any of these cartoons, even in the features. One of the things I love about Charlotte's Web is it's not a Disney cartoon I love Disney features, but this is a pure Hanna-Barbera feature. It could only have been made by them at the height of their busy time. They were making tons of things in the early 70s, late 60s, and they still put this thing out. It has a very handmade, perfection in the imperfections kind of quality. And it's got it, but it tears at your emotions. And it's, it's very, I got a whole chapter on that in there
Yeah.
that explains that. But I like the fact that it's not spectacular. It's very very much what they did in those days, and yet I don't think it would have more impact if it was reanimated with more fluidity or perfect and every line was perfect. Or I think that it's absolutely great the way it is.
Were there any interviews for the book that you couldn't get that you wish you could?
Ted Nichols, and that was Kevin Sandler. Kevin was going to put me in touch with Ted Nichols, and I believe he was not well. I've been trying to get in touch with him for years,
Yeah, I have
because
to.
he was the Milt Franklin to Carl Stalling. He was like Milt Franklin only to Hoyt Curtin, because it was a seamless transition in the late '60s with his music, and then it was seamless coming back out. Though I think what Ted Nichols did with the music was more of the house style than even when Hoyt Curtin came back, and I think there were a lot of reasons for that. But that could go on, and that's a long discussion. But the other person I desperately wanted to talk to, but also fell ill, was Charles Strauss, because the Alice in Wonderland special is one of my all-time favorite things, and I wanted to talk to him about his work on that. I'd read his book, and it mentions it just kind of in passing, but very significantly, that the reason Sammy Davis Jr. did the voice is because Strauss accompanied him to Selma for the march. They met Leonard Bernstein down there, and he did it as a favor. And it turned out, that was the first time that an African American did a voice for an animated primetime special. Scatman Crothers was the first to do a voice for Beanie and Cecil in the early '60s, but I don't think that wasn't a special, and I don't think it was primetime. And Where's Huddles was the first time that there was a African American both doing the voice and the on-screen character in prime time ever on a regular series. I mean, there were only like 10 episodes, but Freight Train was a regular character, and that had never happened in animation. So that's the sort of thing. Hanna-Barbera was just so busy just keeping the doors open.
Yeah.
They didn't run around saying, looky, looky, looky what we're doing. And also they designed the ethnic characters in those shows, the Harlem Globetrotters and stuff, to look like cartoon versions of people. They were not wildly exaggerated facial areas and stuff. You look at them now and it's like, this is a very nice rendering of a person of an ethnicity. It's not a caricature that makes some people uncomfortable.
Yeah. You're commenting on Ted Nichols and Charles Strauss. It kind of highlights the problem with everybody waiting to do Hanna-Barbera scholarship as long as they did, because they hit those Warner Brothers people while there was still a lot of Warner Brothers people alive. And same with the Disney. But yeah, there's just so many people gone from the Hanna-Barbera stable, and it's like a lot, like the primary sources are just gone, and that's so brutal.
Yeah, and you have to reach out to people who are related or are spouses, and they've been very helpful. I mean, the spouse, the wife of Gerard Baldwin, was on a show, and she was really working on the Smurfs too, so she had a lot of insight. And Judy McSwain, who worked for Gordon Hunt and Andre Romano, and from her I learned, again, innovation. Disney, and again, I know I'm doing these back and forth, but Disney created the character voice department in 1988 to create a consistent voice for each character, and in case there needed to be a replacement voice, that there was a proper replacement voice. Joe Barbera did that in 1980 because they were having some inconsistencies. We all know what they were, but it was just getting to be too much to keep track of. And Gordon Hunt was a good friend of his who worked at the Pasadena Playhouse and directed play. In fact, directed a play that Joe had written called The Maid and the Martian, which I'm suspecting ended up being Pajama Party with Annette. But Gordon Hunt was the first person to head a department dedicated to quality control of the voice acting and the direction. That's what Disney Character Voices is. But again, Hanna-Barbera didn't put out a press release. They just got the job done, you know? So
Yeah.
that's the sort of thing that it, on the one hand, I admire. On the other hand, I kind of like, it's a shame that this, but you know, it's still the study of cartoons and the study of animation and the study of television. It was still relatively new when they were in business. They were just figuring out who they were because they didn't even know by the mid 60s, they thought they'd be going into all kinds of entertainment. And then Joe wanted to do live action. So suddenly they were making these movies in the 70s that were very independent of what the cartoons were. And so they were just trying to figure out, you know, are we an all around? And that's why they started the record label. Record label was going to have pop on it and easy listening and jazz and all of this stuff on it. It didn't happen, but that was the plan, that the cartoon records were just the children's line because they were seeing, you know, what do we go, where do we go from here? They had not yet been defined as a cartoon company because, again, the name was not a household name. And then by the time they hired, what was his name? The guy from Desilu who worked on Star Trek, and Herbert Solo, they hired him to sell series for network television. And he came back with the name Hanna-Barbera now is associated with cartoons. And this is like 76, 77. So he started his own company, but he operated out of the Hanna-Barbera studios. And his biggest hit was The Man from Atlantis. So while that wasn't their production, it sort of was at the same time.
Yeah.
But now their name was established. But it happened by default, and it happened, the public decided and the critics decided. They were too busy to decide. They really should have had more concentrate. They should have did what Walt did again, been on camera in some way, were coached on it, got training in it. You know, Joe could do it easily, and Bill could have too, I think. But they just didn't do things like that. You know, I had Gene Vanderpyle's son, Roger, on the podcast. Wonderful interview. He was so close to her. They were such a wonderful woman. And I said, why wasn't she on more talk shows? She said she loved telling stories. She would have loved to do that. They just didn't have people like that. You know, June Foray, how many talk shows was she? She was on Truth or Consequences, maybe Mike Douglas. Mel Blanc was, you know, because, like you said, Warner Brothers cartoons, Mel Blanc was the name, you know, associated with them, and he was still alive. But you didn't see, you just didn't see. Dawes Butler was on Truth or Consequences, and you know they did a few things, but the idea of, and even now, you know, Craig Ferguson had the voice of SpongeBob. You know, and his
Tom
name's,
Kenny.
yeah, Tom Kenny, and he was on. That's because he and his son loved SpongeBob. You probably couldn't convince a network exec, you know, you're going to have a cartoon, but he was on after Letterman, and he was given more creative control because of the time slot. But it wasn't in the mainstream to do things like that. It was just the times. They had an enormous amount of success in one way. The legacy needs to be worked on and established a little bit more because it's worthy of that, I think.
Yeah. When putting the book together, like obviously it's a concept that is broader than your initial kind of log line. What sort of fence posts or guardrails did you kind of put up so that you didn't go much bigger than you kind of had space or time for? How did you rein it in and organize the information?
Well, I actually went over the page count because they were very nice about that, because we wanted to include the discography because, you know, we didn't do that in Mouse Tracks because there was another book that had done it. And while that wasn't definitive, it was as close as anyone's going to get. There was never a discography for what Hanna-Barbera did. So that was a must. But the tricky thing about writing a book about sound recordings, and fortunately, that was another thing that was terrifying me, are people just going to say, what do I care about these records? I'm not going to listen to them. And people have seen there's more to the book than that. And that's been very gratifying. But you're still talking about these things, and
Most of which are not commercially available.
Most of which are not, exactly. But in the case of Mousetracks, that's also true. You have to figure out a way to describe them in an entertaining way without getting too far in the weeds where it ends up being you're just rehashing something from. It's like if you get a book about your favorite show or your favorite animated series or whatever, and it's just synopses, you know, that to me, I want more than that. I want the commentary part of the
Yeah,
DVD,
me too.
you know. So and that was Leonard Maltin's talent too when he wrote the Disney films. He gave you a synopsis, didn't go into too much detail, then commented on what was in the synopsis, then gave you his opinion, which was always substantiated. Now, I didn't always agree with it, but it was substantiated with examples, and then how the critics took it at the time and whatever its legacy has been. So that was kind of the pattern. It's not, you know, because what's on those records is pretty cool. I describe some more than others, but you can't get too hung up on that because that's, even if you have the records and like them, it can be really boring. So that has to always be reined in, and then having to know how much and how little to say, because as you've noticed, I combine things in the chapters. And I wanted the table of contents to be like it was, because if people go through and they go, oh, look, you know, it's Johnny Quest is this one, or, you know, the Banana Splits is this one, they can go to that page and just read that section if they want to. It can be it should be, and I always like to break it into chunks, because I, for one, cannot sit down and read a book for very long. I just can't. I'll either fall asleep or I'll get distracted or whatever. But I like to feel accomplished. So it's in chunks. It's deliberately written in chunks so that you feel like I made it through that chunk, you know? So, and so each of those has to kind of stand on their own. And it should be, if you absolutely know nothing about any of that, it should be readable as well. That's probably the hardest thing to do. There's not a whole lot of assumption on what these things, because every generation has ones they know. So somebody who knows Scooby has no idea who Top Cat is necessarily. You know, I did not at any point assume people were going to know, you know, all things that has to be in there too. But how do you do that without patronizing the people who do know, you know, with too much exposition? So it was all of those challenges, but mostly that what you're writing about, a medium that isn't necessarily right in front of you to do, you have to make it readable in a different one, because you're writing words about something that you listen to, just like critics and whoever write things about films and television, or even other books, and you're not sitting here with that thing necessarily going back and forth. You want what you read to be readable. And look, Lord knows, in college, you read some interminable things about films and things that were like, the sentence is longer than, you know, the high, you know, the freeway. And I got to read it again and again. And
That is something that I genuinely appreciated about the book, is that it definitely takes kind of an academic approach to the material and the research, and you don't make definitive declarative statements
I
where
tried
there
really
is
hard
some
not to.
uncertainty, but it's
Yeah.
also in a very readable, you know, populist kind of style. It's not like reading an academic journal or anything. It does wander a little bit just because the topic can get so broad, and especially when you're moving into talking about other things that some of the musical artists and stuff have done, just to sort of give context. But I know I'm going to appreciate that, you know, when I go back a second or third time,
Yeah.
or I'm just using it as a reference. But yeah, it was not what I expected in a really good way, because I figured you were just going to cover like each record sort of one by one, and right off the bat you're talking about Joe and Bill and Tom and Jerry, and working your way, you know, through the creation of the company till you get to the first record, and then
Yeah, you
talking
could look at
about
it as the records are sort of cherries on the various sundaes, because you don't have to ever listen to any of those records ever if you to enjoy it, and many people won't. As you said, they're not all easy to find. So, you know, so how do you make a book that's kind of pointless to write? Doesn't it seem like so? And that was the struggle. And as far as going off in the weeds a little bit on some of the artists, in Mousetracks, we had the luxury of a sidebar. So if we wanted to write about an artist, they got a sidebar. with a picture. I was going to do that in here, but there was just so much material to cover
I
that,
would rather have the weeds than to not have the weeds.
yeah, you can always go and I'll go back to this next or da 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 da. Um, there's also a wonderful. They did a great job on the audio version, and I love the fact that they got a guy who has um, it's not Gary Owens kind of mock serious. He has a serious gravitas sounding voice, but he's talking about whimsical things, and I interviewed him too, and he had a blast doing it. He was dying to do voices, and occasionally you can hear him slipping into them, sneaking them in. But it was how wonderful to hear someone speaking in this serious tone about Wally Gator, and you know, it is important, but it's still fun. That was the balance. That was the balance line. I appreciate you saying that, because I wanted it to be scholarly. I wanted it, but I didn't want to I didn't want to make it about me and try to be too definitive about the quality of any of them. I wanted to be as objective and make it, I didn't want to be fanboyish, which is very hard because I love the stuff so much. But I tried to do, like in the case of Charlotte Web, give really strong cases for why I felt the way I did. And if I didn't have a strong case, find one. Talk to someone, look it up more. That was part of the challenge, and it's a challenge with any kind of a book like this. You just want the stories to be told, and not in a I'm glad you said that. Not in a declarative way. I don't know for sure that in certain cases, so I will use the phrase, as far as I know, or it could very well be. I didn't like to use the phrase, it is not known, because tomorrow it could be known. I also didn't, I loathe the phrase I see on Facebook, we all know, because we all know who's we. So there were a lot of things I wanted to stay away from, and also not make it too, except for the introduction, make it, it's not my book really, it's Hanna-Barbera's book. And it's about stuff that just, was begging to be. It's like, why hasn't anybody ever explained these weird records to people, or explained why they moved to Saturday morning, or why, this happened? Why did they change Johnny Quest's dad's voice? Why, all the questions everybody that I know who likes it were asking. I don't know how many there are. There's a few, because it's been doing pretty well, which is very gratifying. I'm very, very, very humbled that it worked.
Yeah.
This nice stuff is being responded to. It's a bigger thing than I expected it to be, and it really has added a lot of. And my wife worked real hard on it with me, and she said, it's just been a great thing with both of us. I mean, we're sitting there watching. She's sitting through all these MeTV Toon shows, and she's making comments. I read your book. I've proofed your book. I know I know who this is, Said, I hope you're not getting sick of them. Oh, no, and I'm not. And then she said, she'll say things like, now, wasn't Dick Beals in this Winnie Witch cartoon? And he was, no, it was the McGilla Gorilla where he was, no, it was and it's like, no, those characters were in there 2 times, Ringo. And I'm like, you remembered that? I didn't. So, that's part of the fun, is all of the and the glorious inconsistency of their shows, the complete lack of show Bibles. And I mean, nobody was writing any of this down. Wilma's got 2 last names. Fred and Barney met several ways. There is, Scooby is notorious for that, but so what? You had 60 seconds to understand what Josie in Outer Space was about, and then you're done. Enjoy the show. Don't sit there and go, well, wait a minute. Why were they, how could one, everything today is so over-explained, that none of this is. Just sit down and watch it and have a good time. There's not going to be an in-depth, treatise on this. It's, Peter Potamus, how did he get his hippo hurricane? I don't know. When did he meet So-So? There was no prequel. There was no origin. They're just, how did he make the balloon? I don't know. Just watch. It's fun.
Another thing that I really appreciate about this is that if this is all there is, if nobody else like ventures into this territory again, like this is a really solid, really well put together. It's got a lot of information in it. It's well researched. If that's all there is, that's fine. But there's also a lot of room for other people to come in and just go off in other directions, because you don't have time to talk about every single Hanna-Barbera show and every single
No.
sound cue or whatever. And it's like, if somebody wants to focus on Johnny Quest in a way that you maybe didn't have time in the book, you don't really focus a ton on Scooby-Doo. And that's another example of like, it's 55 years of Scooby-Doo. Like somebody can go and run with that. Or
oh, there's a ton more to do on Scooby.
you talk about Scott Bradley, but not really extensively. And even the Tom and Jerry shows that kind of came out. I interviewed Vivek Madala, who was doing the scores for the Tom and Jerry show. That was running just before I think the movie came out. Yeah, I kind of like that it's a really nice springboard for anybody who has the ambition, but it's also just a really great solid foundation.
Thank you. If anybody feels like I would love to, or I'm going to find a way to expand on that, please do, because I was thinking I was going to be consolidating these reviews of these records into one book, and the rule there is you need to have at least 30% or 33% of new material, and ended up that almost all the book was written fresh. I mean, I gathered all of the reviews I'd done before, and I just wrote from scratch because they were different. And now what I'm finding is if I revisit a subject like Josie, which I did about a month ago on Cartoon Research, it's a brand new article and it has even more stuff in it because I've discovered more stuff since the book, and there wasn't room to go off in directions as much. I thought that was going to be the opposite, but as it turns out, you're absolutely right. There are loads of untapped sources of things to find in there, and yeah, if that does it, great. That's great. It's and like I said, decades ago, people weren't doing it for Warner Brothers, and it was worthy of it. They weren't doing it for Walt Disney. The Disney version came out, which was kind of a negative book in '68. Walt and his daughter and Pete Martin had done the book that was the interviews, and that was like in the late '50s, early '60s. Then when The Art of Walt Disney came out, there was this huge coffee table book. That was a very big deal. And then the Bob Thomas book, which is still an outstanding book and has been revised, came out in the '70s. That's an enormously long time. And now there are Disney historians, you could go throw a rock and you'll hit a Disney historian. Now, don't do that because it wouldn't be nice, but throw a wadded up piece of paper and you'll hit a Disney historian. The internet is loaded with them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as the people doing it are conscientious about, and there's some terrific ones. There's just so many, and you have to just discern which ones. Same with books. There are a ton of Disney books. There are tons of Disney books about individual people. So like you said, the best thing to do is research the books that you're interested in, and you'll get a little bit out of each one. Even Disney, even some of the negative Disney books, some of them are just pure trash. But some of them have bits and pieces that are valuable and have information that's valuable, because you can't get the whole picture from any one point of view. It's like my wife and I say, your parents had, that your parents were different parents for each of their children. It's my sister and brother's view of my dad or my mom are different in a lot of ways because they grew up in different periods. It's the same thing with a person. They're not, this person says this person says that. Is any of them right? I don't know, but the more you read, the more you get a fuller picture. Kind of has to be done that way. So yeah, I'm excited at the idea of people digging, doing a Hong Kong Phooey or whatever. There's so much more to go for that. I was stunned when I started the podcast. I thought there'd be other Hanna-Barbera podcasts out there. I thought, there shouldn't be the only one. And I don't claim it because I keep thinking, well, I'm going to be wrong next week because someone's bound to do it.
mean,
you know.
to be fair, I am kind of a Hanna-Barbera
Well,
podcast.
I know that, and that's why I'm happy to be on here. And you've specialized, but Scooby-Doo is probably their single biggest thing. It's sort of bigger than they became. It's because it's Warner, and it's right up there with Tom and Jerry and all. So
It's
Scooby-Doo is
it's kind of
enormous.
it's kind of funny because the way it all started was I watched Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island one day, and I had questions because I remember being there. Was working in a video store when that movie came out. I remember, all the hype before it and the reaction to it. And I went online, as I do often, and looking for stuff, and there wasn't really a lot out there. And I was kind of like, I have questions, but I don't really have a platform. So I guess I'm doing a Scooby podcast. And it just kind of started from there. And I contacted Glenn Leopold and Steve Bramson. Uh,
Cool.
Over time, I've kind of, even though there's still a ton of stuff to talk about with Scooby, I was getting more and more interested in the studio and just kind of the culture and the people. And like, so many people would talk about working there, and they would just be like, yeah, if I had a minute, I'd go down the hall and just kind of
Yeah.
look over Kenny Muse's shoulder or whatever, and like just being able to see Tex Avery or all of these like legends who were actually working at the studio and the history that was there. And so I just kind of broadened the scope of the show. And ironically, I think I'm too Scooby for a broader animation audience, but I'm maybe a little bit too broadly animation for the core Scooby audience.
Well, it's the same
But
with mine. I'll have somebody on, and they may have done a few HB things, but I'll say, but you can talk about your whole career if you want. I mean, I had Ruta Lee on, and she was Hidia Frankenstone, and she was in Scooby-Doo and the Ghoul School. And I asked her about that laugh she does, laugh, and that sort of thing. And she was great, but we talked about all kinds of things. I would think that people would like that. I would think, because it's just basically, what would you want to know if you had a chance to talk to these people? They've all had lives above and beyond what they were doing. But a lot of it's consistent. If they worked in the studio, Tim Matheson said that. It was so cool to go walk through that. And that's the other thing about Hanna-Barbera's image. There's this, with a lot of studios, there's the paintbrush, there's the artist, and they did that to a degree, but you didn't think necessarily, because the animation was limited, you didn't think that they were sitting down like it was Bambi, and flipping and doing, but it was still great animation. It was just simpler. And if you look at, especially, the really, the backgrounds and the poses, which was what Joe Barbera was so good at, was poses. He was certainly he drew all over things. That's another thing. When people find storyboards and things, he scribbled all over things, and said, do it this way and that way. They weren't just, until they got much older, even when the company got bigger, they still were involved in. So it was a studio filled with artists and talented people that drew
I don't
things.
think people think of Joe and Bill as artists. I think
Yeah.
they think of Joe as a salesman and Bill is the production guy. Like, he just knows how to make the machine work. And it's like, no, they were artists.
Yeah,
they
they
are
were.
artists.
Yeah, and Joe was a master of the gag and the expression. I mean, that was what made Tom and Jerry so great, was expressions. Yeah, and they would, and freezing on an expression, and nothing's moving, but it's still funny. It's so simple, but I love Dino in the car when Fred accidentally takes Dino instead of Wilma to the hospital to have Pebbles. I just love Dino's face, and he's just going like, but it's so funny to me. And it's just two little poses, but sometimes less is more. And what Bill did, because he was this great musician and universally acclaimed in the industry as a master of timing, he could look at an exposure sheet and know not just that they didn't have to do any extra footage because that costs money, but also how to make the gags work as best as they can, and how to, and he was still doing that. There were other people who did also. I'm sure because I found this out from one of the people I interviewed, the pilot for Pup Named Scooby-Doo. He directed that. And they said, "Oh, why don't you take credit?" He said, "I got what I got." He says, "Let the guys who do it take credit," which is pretty cool, But they could do that in a pinch. They knew how to do it, and they just loved making cartoons. There wasn't a high-handed like we're artists and we're changing the world and we're making. They just like making cartoons, And if you look at even the superhero stuff, they're still pure cartoons. I think Joe said, you take a Space Ghost, okay, set up villain coming to do things, and Space Ghost or captures Jan and Jace because that's what their job was, to be captured, and like Lois Lane, and I must save them, and then it's gag, 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 gag. This should stop them. He is kidding us with the freeze ray. It's still a Tom and Jerry cartoon, and I didn't realize that as much until I really started studying, is that the skills that were honed at MGM continued to work even when they were doing stuff that was shipped overseas, like the very good Droopy Master Detective. It's a good show. And that was kind of further away from what they were doing at that time, because now the stuff's getting shipped overseas and now it's more like everybody else's stuff, but it still had that touch to it, I think.
Even talking about the Tom and Jerry stuff, like when people write about it or talk about it, they talk about the animation of Ken Muse or Irv Spence. They don't talk about Joe and Bill. And it's like they were still directing it. They were still in the same way that when you read Chuck Jones talking about a Roadrunner cartoon and he says it has to be 12 frames. It can't be 13. It can't be 11. It's got to be 12 for the joke to work.
Right.
That's what Joe and Bill were doing too.
Yeah, and it's funny how Chuck Jones, and I think Chuck Jones was in a very enviable position to become Chuck Jones, and because Chuck he did not get sucked into a organization, like Bob McKimson did when they started making later Warner cartoons, and even like Friz Freleng did when DePatie Freleng started making more things and having to cut corners and stuff. Chuck Jones was able to establish himself as a boutique, and he had this group. He had Maurice Noble, and he had just phenomenal people, Ben Washam and all those names you saw over and over. He didn't do it by himself, and not anything against Chuck Jones, but I do feel like if you look at the greatest Looney Tunes he worked on, take away Milt Franklin or Carl Stahl, take away Treg Brown sound effects, take away Mel Blanc and Arthur Q. Bryan, take away the layout. He didn't do this in a vacuum. He did it with these top great people. Well, so did Bill and Joe, but it seems inverted with them. It's like, well, the cartoon was good in spite of the fact that it was, and I think that's just the way things evolve, because it just self did it. I don't think it's necessarily accurate, but it's just self did. So I'm glad you're doing it.
It's kind of interesting that Chuck actually did work on Tom and Jerry and they weren't as good.
Yes, he did, and those are uniformly considered, well, they're not the same. They're gorgeous cartoons.
Yeah.
They are picture perfect. I mean, the credits, everything about them is just so magnificent looking, but it isn't the same, and I don't know if maybe that was because they said tone down the violence, but it wasn't there wasn't the violence that made the Tom and Jerry. They were violent, but there was something about what, having Chuck Jones had a certain kind of way of the characters make the faces they made and the things like that. And they worked great with Bugs and worked great with the Grinch, didn't work the same way with Tom, and I don't know, it's just a matter of the right person for the right thing and the right time and the right place. And as I said, Hanna-Barbera did awfully well in their heyday as far as a successful company and all of that. They were so busy doing that and employing people that they didn't really take much time to, or even necessarily see, or did the industry even welcome their establishment as an entity. It's anybody's guess, but podcasts like yours are really important because you're doing more than just saying, "Oh, wasn't it cool when Shaggy ate a sandwich?" That kind of thing. You're talking to people who did it. So yeah, I stand corrected. You are doing a Hanna-Barbera. I'm embarrassed and ashamed now. Gosh.
It is also worth saying, like you said, we're not trying to tear down Chuck Jones, and we're not. It's part of the
No.
like scholarship is to there are certain established norms. There are people that are put on pedestals and they're elevated above other people, and you're just trying to kind of elevate those other people up to the same level because they're all doing the same work, just of different tastes or qualities or whatever. But it's like they all still deserve the same attention.
Yeah.
So not not taking away anything from the genius of Chuck
No,
Jones
he's
and
worthy
his
of what he got.
accomplishments. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's just there's also these other people. Can be
As
talked
my
about.
mother used to say, if you took too many from a dish at dinner, there are other people. My mother was
So
Italian and from New York. And no, it wasn't just New York. It's New York. It's the best.
I do have some other questions about the book, but we've been talking for a long time,
Have
and I
we
kind of
really? I
feel,
guess we have. Whoops.
and I don't mind, but I don't want to monopolize like your evening, so I'm happy cutting it here if you're good with that.
Well, we can come back another time if you want. That would be great.
Yeah, always happy
Maybe we'll
to.
explore some other avenue, or yeah, or just continue because yeah, I enjoy I'm enjoying this immensely, and I appreciate the things that we're exchanging about. It's important for these things to be talked about, and I think you're doing just a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I told you right off the bat that like I lost half my questions on my computer, and I was like, I'm not sure. And here we are, like 2 hours later,
Well,
still talking.
you said about in the book that I'll go off somewhere, and people who are watching or listening to this can see. Yeah, Greg's gone into talking about something. It's in another county now. Now let's bring it back to where we were, because yeah, I tend to sidetrack, footnote and footnote.
Well, that's the job. Your job is to info dump, and my job is to bring us back if we need to come back.
And that's why AI will never be completely effective.
That's right.
As far as AI, and it's probably a lovely thing and people enjoy it and isn't that nice. I don't like it taking people's jobs away, but I don't think it is going to be the end all and be all, because if you watch the movie Desk Set, I always like to point this out. Desk Set with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy and Miss Landers from Leave It to Beaver and Joan Blondell and Dina Merrill. How could you go wrong? And the screen from Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. It's the same prop. You know that thing with the squares on it? So even that it's IBM actually co-sponsored this movie. The idea was about it's 1957, about a computer coming to make things easier, but they were all terrified because they were researchers at a network for like game shows and things, and everybody called them with trivia questions, and they thought we're doomed, and they kept waiting for the pink slips. And what it proved was, yes, there may be certain things that are eliminated, there may be certain modifications in how things are done, but what computers cannot do, and even AI, they said on 60 Minutes, they can't think intuitively. They can think and they can process, but they can't always put, like we were doing, putting the objects together, and they show that at the end, and it's like, I love this movie. First of all, I love everybody in the movie, but and Miss Landers from Leave It to Beaver. But that's the absolute truth. And to this day, I don't think that's been contradicted. So I think there's hope for the human race, and that we're not going to end up like Eric Braeden and the Colossus, the Forbin Project.
So for anybody who has been inspired by our conversation to check out Hanna-Barbera, The Recorded History, where is it available? And you mentioned the audiobook. There's an
Available, yeah,
audiobook now.
it's on all your favorite book outlets. Barnes and Noble has it. Amazon's got it. You can get it directly from University Press of Mississippi. You can drop me a personal on my page or on my website. It's gregovision.com if you want to get a copy, a signed copy, because we can manage that too. Sometimes I put them on eBay, but that if you want that, I mean, I don't, if as long as you buy it, and you can also buy it as an ebook or as an audiobook, whatever you prefer. And I'm hoping more libraries will stock it so you could just check it out. But it's the kind of book that you want to go back and take a look at. Like, let's say they've just started showing a series and it's like, oh, I think I want to revisit information on that. And you don't get enough out of Wikipedia, and you don't get enough about, from various things. You know that this book is kind of cool, and they might have made cool records out. I would, I'm very, very pleased that people, and I thank everyone who's bought it, and even those who haven't and have read it and liked it, and I thank you very much too.
And for anybody who might be inspired to start collecting old Hanna-Barbera records, what would you recommend?
Oh, golly. Well, first of
Is
all,
that just like an eBay thing, or are
it's an
there
eBay thing,
avenues?
and the some of them are remarkably not as high priced as you might expect. What I usually do is I have an ongoing search, save this search so it comes up every time something comes up. It'll tell you. Some are more hard, some are harder to get than others. Even the HBRs, some of those can be purchased. The Columbia remakes from the 70s, they're not as good, and I explain that in the book, but they'll do if you can't get the HBRs. But they don't sound as good, and the artwork isn't as lush. There's also the early Colpix. They're a little bit harder to get because they're a little more rare and they're older. And the golden records, which are sometimes the original cast, sometimes not. Peter Pan's the same way. We're talking Scooby-Doo. The most genuine Peter Pan Hanna-Barbera records are the Scooby-Doo one, the original cast, with the exception of Casey Kasem. But and those are, again, I don't think those are all that difficult to find. With a children's record, you have to be careful of it was loved, so it could be scratchy and worn and thrown around the house, and the dog chewed on it and things like that. Sometimes you have to try more than one time to get and hold the needle down over the skips and things like that. But it's pretty fun. It's just neat having that disc that has that stuff on an album. I'm hoping they may reissue some of these, but I don't. I'm not gonna put any money on it or anything like that. They are out there, and so I don't want to recommend any specifics because your eras all vary. Charlotte's Web is very accessible now. It used to be it wasn't, but it was released on CD and on vinyl, and now it's downloadable on Spotify. Very little Hanna-Barbera genuine stuff right now. I'm hoping that'll change. You can't get any of the original themes right now because of legal issues. There are some very good sound-alikes. There's one on that's in the book that's quite good, and there's other ones, but there's no soundtrack ones. The Hanna-Barbera Christmas album, Christmas Sing-Along, is also on download, and of course you can look around on YouTube and see if there's a decent copy. Warner's pretty, they're like Disney. They want to protect their stuff, and we'll see. I think like the cartoons on MeTV Toons that are mainly aimed at adult connoisseurs like us. The earlier records might be made available on Record Store Day or something like that for the same reason. Not anything I know about at this juncture, but
Is there but you never say never?
I never say never, because I wouldn't have believed there was a Munster Go Home soundtrack, and you just never know. The Johnny Quest one was a miracle. That's
I love that
magnificent.
CD.
Oh, so you never know. You just never know. But we've got them to watch. You can watch them on MeTV Tunes with an antenna or on most of your systems. There's a ton of them on DVD, and little by little they're turning out beautiful Blu-rays, which really show off how really artsy these things are, as far as these people really knew art direction. They knew color, they knew composition, and layouts and stuff like that. Okay, maybe it's not moving like a Disney feature, but it's supposed to be on your TV. And you also got to remember, it was supposed to be on a 1967 TV or a 1972 TV. If you look at the old, I know I'm going off in the weeds again, but if you look at the early, like Huckleberry Hounds and all, the titles, even Adam Ant, the titles are close to the center. They're doing that because TVs used to bleed, and cut off the sides of things. All of that is being worked on. They had all of those obstacles to overcome. So I just think they're fun and cool, and I hope everybody else listening does too.
Is there a good collector community around the children's records?
There are some good collectors on YouTube who supply some really nice things in good quality. There are not a whole lot of specifically children's records collectors on Facebook that I've found that are specifically, and there's not a lot really. I'm sort of emphasizing the cartoon, TV, and film connections to them. I think that's more of what you see. You know, the sites, the pages I go to, there's a lot of Hanna-Barbera ones, a lot of good ones. There's a lot of cartoon ones, a lot of television ones, those ones. But as far as again, same thing. That's to me a genre, records for kids from the like the post-war all the way up to '88. That's an area that isn't really talked about very much too. And it's a pretty interesting era, and there's some pretty cool stuff that was done and there's all those great labels like Golden and Peter Pan and even Sesame Street in its heyday and things like that. So
I had some Muppet records that I loved.
oh gosh, yeah, they're terrific, and when they were reissued, they weren't always reissued intact. So yeah, if you find the vinyl album, like the two Muppet Show albums, they never really were reissued exactly the way they came out originally. So they're worth searching for. They're terrific albums.
You mentioned gregavision.com. Is there anywhere else online you are
I've
findable
got
or want to be found?
Facebook page. We've got a Hanna-Barbera, Fantastic World of Hanna-Barbera podcast page, Hanna-Barbera Music and Voices. And yeah, you can email me or PM me, whatever you'd like. If you like the podcasts, just like yours, please like and subscribe and all that you're supposed to do with podcasts, because that helps a lot with that. And we were talking before we started about YouTube. I'm trying to put some of these onto YouTube because people don't always know how to do or like to do streaming. So I'm just loading the audio up, but only 24 hours in a day, and I have to have my eggs.
All right. Well, this has been fun. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for coming on the show. Obviously, it was a long time coming. Completely my fault, but we did it. We're here.
It was worth the wait. It was worth it. Thank you so very much.
Awesome. Hopefully, you'll come back on the show sometime.
Just let me know. We'll do it.
All right. Take care, Greg.
Thanks. Bye.
And there you have it. That concludes my conversation with writer, podcaster, and audio historian Greg Ehrbar. I hope you had fun with that. And if your curiosity is piqued and you have some interest in checking out more of Greg's work, feel free to hit up his website, gregovision.net. There you'll find links to his two podcasts, The Fantastic World of Hanna and Barbera, as well as the Pop Culture Classics podcast. And you can pick up any of his books, Mouse Tracks, The Story of Walt Disney Records, or of course, Hanna-Barbera, The Recorded History, From Modern Stone Age to Meddling Kids. If you want to throw a little extra support to this podcast, you can like, share, follow, subscribe, all the button pushes on whatever podcatcher or app or platform you're catching the show on. If there is an option to rate and review, that would be great if you could do that. It does help with the algorithms and getting the show into the eyes and ears of people who may be interested in this content but just not know that I or this show exist. Now, I erroneously stated on my last episode that I was available on Blue Sky under a podcast named Scooby-Doo. That was incorrect. A podcast named Scooby-Doo is where I am on Instagram. On Blue Sky, it's essentially the same as what I was on Twitter. It is Scooby-Doo-cast. So if you are searching me on Blue Sky, search Scooby-Doo-cast and you are likely to find me. I do think if you searched a podcast named Scooby-Doo, you probably would have found me, but you can also just search under Scooby-Doo-cast and that might bring me up quicker. So if you want to follow me on social media, there's the Blue Sky that I just mentioned. I'm also on Instagram. There's the WordPress blog where I have the occasional post and some mini interviews that I did with people regarding Scooby Apocalypse variant covers. And I think there's also the email. You can contact me, scoobypodcast@gmail.com. if I remember correctly. I've gotten really bad at this. I haven't done this in so long that I probably should have scripted this part out. I'm just not used to rattling off kind of all the socials and contact stuff anymore. Anyways, that's going to be it for me for this episode. Next episode, if it hasn't come out at the same time, around the time that this episode drops, there's also going to be an episode of APNSD Extra, which is going to have a review of the Scooby-Doo Terror Time Collector's Edition Blu-ray, as well as a conversation with the folks who made that possible. Really excited to be bringing that to y'all. And then after that is going to be the kind of special project that I was honestly hoping to have out by now, but it just seems that everybody's lives is making it so that everything is taking its own time, and any expectation that I have for scheduling or whatever is basically kind of out the window, and I just have to do it as it happens. So maybe that could be a slogan for the show. Do it as it happens, but do is like DOO. Anyways, thanks again for checking out the show. Really appreciate your support. Really appreciate your continued support. I've noticed that even during the hiatus, the metrics have been pretty good. So people have been either discovering the show or revisiting the show. So yeah, you have my gratitude. Hope everybody is well, stays safe, and we will see you next time on a podcast named Scooby-Doo. Take care.
The balladeer, whose name is Kyle! The hovering balladeer! Kyle! Everybody cheer! This is how we solve the mystery. This is how we solve the mystery. So in summation, this narration's my donation to the art of mystery solving dictation. And here's what the bad guys say when they play where the law forbids.
Would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
This is how we solve the mystery. Bye.